Thank you for having me, Martha.
So you said that you thought that there would be an infrastructure bill that could be looked at on Monday and that you all were working through the weekend. Will you have that bill in place for everybody to look at come tomorrow?
Martha, I believe we will, because the one thing I hear, I've been all across Virginia the last couple of days, people want us to invest in our infrastructure. If you step back, we have actually are investing at about half the rate that we invested in our infrastructure as we did in the 1990s. Matter of fact, Infrastructure Week became, as you know, a joke line during the last administration. They kept promising they were going to do infrastructure. It never came to pass. A group of us, 10 of us, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, been working on this for the last couple of months. This is the same group who actually put together the last COVID deal under President Trump. So we know each other, we trust each other, and I think you're going to see whether it's $100 billion plus for roads and bridges, whether it's close to $50 billion for resiliency for those coasts who are having sea level rise, whether it's making the kind of investments in cleaner buses. For example, our country's going to buy 20,000 new school buses over the next couple of years. Should those buses be made in China or made in America? I think they ought to be made in America. And there's a host of new things around making our grid smarter, broadband. I think we've got a menu of options. And candidly, we've had those menus of spending items agreed to for weeks. What we have had to work through, because my Republican colleagues did not want to use enhanced or actually making sure we follow our IRS tax laws. So we've had to replace some of those pay-fors. We're down to the last couple of items, and I think you're going to see a bill Monday afternoon.
What do you say to those? I know there was that dispute over whether or not the IRS part of that deal would go through. There's also, do you want to see $800 billion in unspent COVID funds be part of this infrastructure bill? Is that going to happen?
Well, interesting thing, Martha, is everybody was for, well, where is there some of these unspent COVID funds that came from the 2020 legislation? Again, most of that legislation passed under President Trump. Everybody's for scraping those dollars until you go back and look at the actual programs. For example, hospital relief. For example, some of the programs for small businesses. We are and have agreed jointly on about roughly $70 billion of funds that were not unspent that will be redeployed to help pay for this infrastructure package. So,
what do you say to the criticism that you heard from Senator Scott?
The challenge is, though, Martha, you got folks who want to make big, bold statements, but sometimes don't want to roll up their sleeves, get into the details, and make the very hard choices about where we find these pay-fors. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
You heard Senator Scott and others said that they didn't have a bill to vote on last week, and this is what Senator Schumer said about his intention and his timeline. Watch this, and then I'd love to get your answer on the other side.
I have every intention of passing both major infrastructure packages, the bipartisan infrastructure framework and a budget resolution with reconciliation instructions, before we leave for the August recess. That's the schedule I laid out at the end of June, and that's the schedule I intend to stick to.
I mean, that's very ambitious. Democrats hold the House, the Senate, the White House. Can you get those two things done by this August recess, Senator?
I sure want to. And by the way, there's a little bit of wordsmanship going on here. There were a half dozen times when Mitch McConnell was leader of the Senate where he would put up what's called a shell bill because you've not finished the details, and then you substitute the actual text once you get into the negotiations, because there'll be amendments on this infrastructure bill. But we'll have that text. It'll be out there tomorrow. After we're done with the bipartisan bill, I would love to have some of my Republican friends join on the reconciliation effort, the larger effort that looks at things like universal preschool, that looks at things like a free community college, that looks at things like a broad-based middle-class tax cut for every family that has a child in terms of the child tax credit. I would hope some Republicans would join with us on that, but if not, I think the group of the 50 Democrats will have to work through that resolution as well.
Well, Senator, obviously there's a lot of concern about the inflation that we see rising in the country, and Senator Graham spoke to this just the other day. Let's watch that.
There's a mandate in this bill to require every employer to offer paid family leave. That sounds good, I guess, on its face until the employer has to come up with the cash to meet the mandate in this bill. Guess what the employer is going to do? They're going to increase their prices because the government has increased their cost. And over time, as we increase taxes in this bill, which they will have to do, there's less money to do the things that businesses need to do, like to modernize and hire people. So this is a nightmare for American business. It's going to be a nightmare for American consumers if this reconciliation bill passes.
So he's talking about driving up the costs for American businesses across this country and what the impact might be on consumers. Do you share those concerns about this enormous $3.5 trillion bill?
Well, Martha, unlike a whole lot of the folks I work with in the Senate, I actually spent close to 30 years in business. I was involved in the telecommunications industry, started a very large company. I can actually read a balance sheet, which is something that some of my colleagues can't. The amazing thing that Lindsay just mentioned is there is every industrial country in the world, with the exception of the United States, provides some level of paid leave if somebody's having a baby or has got a death in the family. Other countries have managed to do that, and their economies are still moving forward. Matter of fact, if there are inflationary pressures, it is because we've put $5 trillion into the economy, $3.5 trillion of that under President Trump, to respond to the COVID crisis. I think history will actually treat those investments as appropriate because we are seeing our economy rebound. We've added 3 million jobs in the last 5 months. And Martha, I just got to tell you, as somebody who spent longer in business than I have in politics, if we don't invest in road, rail, water and sewer systems, broadband, those infrastructure investments will actually help us grow the economy. Virtually every economist from left to right agrees on that.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who spent 30 years in business, as you say, what about the bottom line? What about these trillions and trillions of dollars that have been spent since COVID? And then you have an economy that's starting to get moving again. The fear is that all of this money that you talk about that's being thrown at this problem is going to ignite inflation that will not be just transitory, that will be long lasting. And I don't think Americans have a long memory for what that actually feels like for companies and individuals. Are you concerned about that as you seek to push through this $3.5 trillion deal?
Well, again, am I concerned about inflation? I'm always concerned about inflation. But I also believe the Federal Reserve has pointed out that they think this is short-term in nature. We've already seen things like the cost of lumber, which went sky high, start to come down. We've already seen a little bit of relaxing in the used car market. Finally, one of the problems around our car market was because we've not had available semiconductor chips. We need to make investments there to keep up with China. And when you talk about some of these numbers, 3.5 trillion, big number, but that is spent out over 10 years. So that's not
still
all
a big
being spent in a single year. Right, but nothing near to the $5 trillion that we've spent in the last year under both Trump and Biden.
All right. Just in general, as a Democrat, when you look at this period of time with control over the White House, the House, and the Senate, are you disappointed with what you've been able to get done so far?
Well, I actually think the American Rescue Plan that ended up providing, for example, the middle-class tax cut for every family that makes less than $150,000 that's got children with the child tax credit, I think that makes sense. I think the dollars that have gone to state and local government to shore those up, who lost revenues during COVID, makes sense. And in a state like mine, I was a telecom guy. I'm proud to have worked with my governor. We're going to make sure every household in Virginia has high-speed broadband by 2024. That would only happen because of the American Rescue Plan. I frankly think, and I would hope, every state would do that same kind of plan, because if you don't have broadband going forward, your chance for any kind of economic future is not going to be bright.
Before I let you go, do you think the president should move to get behind the idea of eliminating the filibuster in order to get some of these things through while this window is still open?
Listen, Martha, I don't want the Senate to become like the House, but I do believe when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to that basic right to exercise and participate in democracy, I get very worried what's happening in some of these states where they are actually penalizing, saying if you give somebody water waiting in line to vote, or in states like Texas where they're saying a local government can overcome the results of a local election. That is not democracy. And if we have to do a small carve out on filibuster for voting rights, that is the only area where I'd allow that kind of reform.
You don't think that's a slippery slope?
Listen, I would wish we wouldn't even have started this a decade ago when the Democratic leaders actually changed the rules. I don't think we'd have the Supreme Court we did if we still had a 60-vote margin on the filibuster, but we are where we are. And the idea that somehow to protect the rights of the minority in the Senate, we're going to cut out rights of minorities and young people all across the country, that's just not right to me.
Senator Warner, thank you. Good to have you here today.